The second to last meeting of the Socratic Club for this academic year. Dr. Brian Henning of the Philosophy Department is going to be discussing stewardship and the roots of the ecological crisis. In parts of the world that are shaped by the Jewish and Christian scriptures, the dominant model for thinking about the relationship between humans and nature has been stewardship. While God created and is sovereign over the natural order, he delegated governance of nature to human beings, the only beings in creation to model or mirror the divine image. A classic expression of this view can be found in the first chapter of the Bible in Genesis chapter 1, verses 26 and following. Then God said, "Let us make mankind in our image and our likeness, so that they may rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky, over the livestock and all the wild animals, and over all the creatures that move along the ground." So God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God he created them, male and female he created them. And God blessed them and said to them, "Be fruitful and increase in number, fill the earth and subdue it. Rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky and every other living creature that moves on the ground." Here in this passage, you find the two key ideas that ground the stewardship model. First, human dignity, the human reflecting of the image of God, and secondly, delegated authority over the earth. Despite having a long pedigree, the stewardship model came under sustained attack in the 20th century, primarily on the grounds that it was too anthropocentric, too focused on the needs, values, and objectives of human beings. Additional criticisms have been made of the stewardship model as too theocentric, too dependent on the theological claims of creation and divine sovereignty, problematic in the context of post-Darwinian secular culture. Pope Francis' recent encyclical letter addresses the question of the relationship, in a way bringing the theological back into dialogue with ecological thinking. In the view of our speaker today, Francis' views extend both the stewardship model and the sustainability models into what might be called deep sustainability. This topic is a natural for the Gonzaga Socratic Club, natural and ecological, I might even say, focused as it is on reflecting on Christian doctrine and practice in the Socratic spirit of following the argument wherever it leads. Our speaker today, as I've mentioned, is Dr. Brian Henning, professor of philosophy and environmental studies at Gonzaga, and fellow, and we might even say fellow on sustainability issues, but also driving force on sustainability issues. That's not an official title, but that's the function that Dr. Henning plays. He's the author or co-author of a number of books, including the recent text, Riders on the Storm, Ethics in an Age of Climate Change, published by Anselm Academic, and he's going to tell us more about some of that stuff. But welcome our speaker, Dr. Brian Henning.
Thank you, David, and thank you all for being here this evening. I'm going to do a little bit of show and tell, so I'm going to pass around a couple of books. The presentation tonight is meant to be a sort of a popular, accessible version of some of the things that I've written. I'm trying to not then just read a dense paper that's hard to process. I tried to sort of do a version which is me talking to certain points, and hopefully that works. And then if you wanted to, you could to refer to some of the stuff in print at your leisure. So I'll just sort of pass these around. There's one essay that I have in the anthology that I'm drawing from, and then the small teaching text, which is written for a general audience. The Riders in the Storm book is written for a general audience, not for an academic audience. For undergraduates in particular, it's an intended audience, so you should find it relatively accessible. I'd like to start tonight, before I say anything actually, just to set sort of a context for our thought by showing a 5-minute clip from a movie that just came out. It's a movie version of a book. Naomi Klein's book, This Changes Everything, came out recently, and the movie just came out just in the last few weeks. And so I'm going to show a 5-minute clip, and then I'll jump into my comments if I can make technology work. Let's see. And the sun is going to wash us out, but we'll do our best here.
Shall I pull?
Well, that's up to you. It might be too dark once it goes away, so it's That's not bad right there, yeah.
Can I be honest with you? I've always kind of hated films about climate change. What is it about those vanishing glaciers and desperate polar bears that makes me want to click away? Is it really possible to be bored by the end of the world? It's not that I don't care what happens to polar bears. It's just that we're told that the cause isn't out there, it's in us. It's human nature. We're innately greedy and short-sighted. And if that's true, there is no hope. But when I finally stopped looking away, traveled into the heart of the crisis, met people on the front lines, I discovered so much of what I thought I knew was wrong. And I began to wonder, what if human nature isn't the problem? What if even greenhouse gases aren't the problem? What if the real problem is a story, one we've been telling ourselves for 400 years? This first struck me in the craziest place. I was in a stately home in the English countryside that looked an awful lot like Downton Abbey. It was an invitation-only meeting hosted by the world's oldest scientific organization, the Royal Society. Instead of ordering around the servants, the people here were trying to order around the sun. I mean the sun in the sky.
Rate of carbon emissions and so on.
They were discussing a plan to spray chemicals into the stratosphere to turn down the temperature for planet Earth.
What you need to do is put a small number of particles up in the upper part of the atmosphere. And those particles will deflect just a tiny bit of light. One garden hose to the sky could eliminate global warming for the entire northern hemisphere.
In other words, let's solve the problem of pollution with more pollution.
So people are terrified about talking about this because they're scared that it will prevent us cutting emissions.
Right, and also that it's sulfuric acid. We're bearing the lead. Is there any possible way this could come back to bite us in the ass? Blanketing the earth in sulfuric acid is
Here's the thing. This idea may be crazy, but it's also totally logical within the story that the Royal Society pioneered in the 17th century. Here's how it goes. The Earth is not, as most people thought back then, a mother to be feared and revered. No. Science had granted men godlike powers. The Earth is a machine, and we are its engineers, its masters. We can sculpt it like a country garden. We can extract from it whatever we want. These scientists help turn the mother into the motherlode. This story is where the long road to global warming began. When I realized that, I stopped tuning out those sad polar bears, because unlike human nature, stories are something we can change.
All right, so that is being played on campus in April, and if I was better prepared, and I can tell you afterwards the exact date, the full rest of the movie, if you're interested in watching the rest of it, we'll be having a free screening in the theater in Hemmingson this semester in a few short weeks.
What's the name of the movie?
This changes everything.
This changes.
Exactly, yeah.
Same as the book.
That's right, that's right. So my approach tonight is going to take up where Klein is left off in the sense that she's claiming that Part of the problem, a large part of the problem, has to do with stories that we tell ourselves and how we fit into those stories. This interests me because I'm particularly interested in the interface between our conceptions of ourselves and reality, between metaphysics and ethics, sort of the interface of those, one determining in large part the other. And so she's using the idea of story, but really what we're talking about is a worldview, a conception, a metaphysics. So this looks worse than it is, but this is what you've got to survive through as far as my talk. So let's jump into the first. The story that we're told most dominantly today about how to conceive of ourselves and our relationship to nature, how to go about trying to solve our ecological problems, is in the context of the sustainability paradigm. That the best way to think about how to solve our problems is to follow what the UN has been saying since the 80s, and that is to design societies and cultures in a way that allows us to develop sustainably. And particular sustainability has, since this time, most dominantly been defined as figuring out a way to meet the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet its needs. It's a very nice conception. It's kind of terrifying that this would be, that anybody would want to do something that wasn't compatible with allowing future humans to flourish, right? And so this is supposed to set a bar on limits to growth. That we need to design our communities and use resources in a way that's sustainable, compatible with future human flourishing in addition to present human flourishing. As far as it goes, what I'm interested in particular, because I'm an ethicist, is trying to say, is the sustainability paradigm anything like an adequate moral philosophy? Could it be an adequate ethical conception of how we ought to relate to the natural world? And some philosophers will answer yes, that it is maybe the best we can do. It's the most central core moral concept. Brian Norton is one of the philosophers who would defend this view. I, maybe controversially, given that I'm Mr. Sustainability, disagree with this claim. And this came to me as I was working on the Writers in the Storm book. I was thinking about our attempted solutions to our ecological problems, and they're primarily technological solutions. I was thinking of, in a way, when I think about the bright, shiny, sustainable future, what came to my mind was sort of a Jetsons-like future that we're trying to move toward, that progress is bringing about the Jetsons world. We've got Roombas, to clean our floors, but we don't really yet have flying jetpacks, unfortunately, and moving sidewalks, which is pretty cool. But Jetsons, you might know, is a 1960s era technological utopia. And, in this technological utopia, we've got the benefit of not having teachers' unions. Finally been broken by the employment of effective teach bots, which is a huge improvement over us living and breathing types. And society is still centered on, of course, what's most important, as we know. And if you recall, just a few years ago, this is what my 2000 celebration at the millennium, when we were waiting for the Y2K bug. Either the Y2K bug would kill us all, or it looked like this, as you might recall. I assume yours looked like this, was year 2000, 16 years ago. So the Jetsons is our bright, shiny sustainability future. But then I also got to thinking, is it such a great life? They're all living up on pedestals above the planet for some reason. Why they're not on the planet anymore? Why not? I don't know what's going to happen down there, what they did, right? But now we're up above, and we're in, so high up, we have to be in hermetically sealed bubbles, right? There is no air, there is no running water, there are no trees, there is no nature, there's no wilderness. There's one dog, as far as I go, right? And so then I started thinking more, is this a technological utopia, or is this more like, if we scratch the surface, a technological dystopia? And so then I thought of another more contemporary example, which will work for some of you and not others, as these things usually do. I started to think, well, is the Jetsons really WALL-E? And if you didn't see WALL-E, it was a more recent comic, which you could argue, cartoon was actually just another version of the Jetsons, in my opinion. What happened was we consumed everything. We used every resource on the planet. All of nature is dead. And we had to abandon the planet. These little robots, these little WALL-E robots are compacting trash And they're piling it into these giant, I don't know if you can tell, these are actually piles of trash. This is not skyscrapers, these are piles of trash. The little robots are compacting it and spitting it out into these little pieces, cleaning up the planet. Even though we've left, they kind of keep doing it because they're programmed to do so, right? And poor Wally, he looks so sad, but he accidentally finds one living thing, and that sets in motion the rest of the plot points of the movie. But my point is actually that humans have achieved a much better sustainable future. They're not on the planet anymore. They're off in space on a perfect technological utopia where every need is met for them on the axiom, where they drink all their calories, they only communicate via screens, they never even have to walk, because we know walking is for suckers, and so it's awesome, right? And the beach looks really, really awesome too, right? So it's the best of all worlds. And my favorite screen capture I could find, welcome to economy, right? You guys, welcome to economy. Big and Large is the name of the company that hosts civilization at this point. This is not really a government, this is a corporation, Big and Large. Buy, shape, shop, live, right? So this is this is the technological utopia we've developed. What got me thinking about juxtaposing the Jetsons and Wall-E is this. It wasn't clear to me that there's anything about the sustainability paradigm which rules this possibility out as anything other than a desirable end. Does it say that there's anything wrong with this? And if it can be done, and if it can be done indefinitely into the future, this is sustainable. And then I find deeply bothersome that this is a future reality compatible with the sustainability paradigm. So, to put it into three straightforward points, my concern with the sustainability paradigm, well, let me say the positive things and then I'll put my three concerns. Positively, I'm not arguing that we shouldn't try to be sustainable. That's not my point. I'm not saying we should try to be unsustainable. I'm not saying that solar panels and windmills are bad, or that I try to hybrid. I'm not saying that at all. I'm simply saying as an approach to ethics and morality for a framing moral conception, it's not sufficient. It's too anemic. It can't bear the weight that's being placed upon it. Why? First of all, it's anthropocentric in most of its formulations, meaning it limits meaning and value to things in relationship to humans. The classical definition is something is sustainable if it allows the present to meet its needs without compromising the ability of future humans to meet their needs. And so, if, like me, you want to say, yes, humans are valuable, but you know what, also non-human things are also valuable, the sustainability paradigm is usually not making that point. It's usually kind of cast in anthropocentric terms that really only present and future humans matter. Secondly, it is not necessarily, but very frequently technophilic, meaning just a fancy word for Jetsons, Wall-E, fancy technology solutions to our problems. That the way to address our ecological problems is to invent our way out of them. We don't need to change anything about what we're doing. We're doing everything right, because obviously our conceptions of the good life are just perfectly good. All we need to do is invent new technologies, and we can keep on as we have before. And it's not that I want to bet against our engineering prowess. We are really, really good at it. My concern is that this management approach, it doesn't rule out, again, the Wall-E sort of reality. It's neutral, as I'm going to say in the third point. It's morally vacuous. It's neutral as to what it is that we're trying to sustain. Or to put it another way, it presupposes a conception of the good life. It doesn't give us one. It says, we want to have a good life, and whatever good life is, we want to be sustainable. It doesn't really, it's neutral as to what counts as a good or a bad life. And so, in that way, I would say it's actually not even a moral category. It's not an ethical category at all. It's really just a biophysical concept masquerading as an ethical concept. Biophysical meaning has to do with what processes can be done indefinitely. But it doesn't tell us how to adjudicate between which things are good and which things are bad, which is one of the primary points of ethics, is to help us to figure that out. Just to repeat again, I'm not saying that all sustainability accounts necessarily have these three problems. I'm saying the dominant way in which it's described does. frequently. You could redefine sustainability in a way that would avoid these problems if you wanted to and still use the term. In fact, in the book, I was really debating, should I try and rehabilitate the term and maybe put deep in front of it and, try and recapture it, or should I just, abandon it? It's philosophy is always in this problem, like, do you try and resurrect or rehabilitate or redefine a good term, or do you say it's too badly damaged and we'll just let them have it and I give up? And so I'm still a little bit torn myself on sustainability as a concept. So just to summarize this stage, this is my point, right? That we need to have, if we're looking for an ethical category, we need to have some way of knowing what would count as a good life, and sustainability ain't it. So maybe if we're looking for more ethical content, maybe rather than using sustainability, which is more of a biophysical concept, maybe instead we should use stewardship. And before I get to that, which will be my third point, I wanted to set it in the context of, and Dr. Calhoun was sort of setting this up nicely for me, that's part of the difficulty with the sustainability paradigm is it really doesn't try to get at describing those story components that are underneath the ecological crisis. That, in fact, I would argue that the sustainability paradigm in a way is just trying to keep the status quo's notion of a good life in place and then make it sustainable. And so I want to suggest that that's not going to work. If we really want to solve the problem, the ecological crisis, we need to figure out what are its real roots. And these roots are, Klein says, Naomi Klein, the movie said, that it went back 400 years to the origins of modernity, where a new story came about which said that humans are separate from nature and nature is a machine, and she's not wrong. But I think you could argue, and this guy Lynn White Jr. did argue in 1967 that it goes farther back. It goes not back 400 years, but more like 3,400 years to origins of the Judeo-Christian tradition. It's a very provocative thesis. I will warn you. Get your right vegetables ready at this point. His thesis is that the roots of the ecological crisis are ultimately to be found in a worldview which defines humans as set apart from nature and masters over nature. It started a narrative, it replaced a former narrative, a former story which saw humans as part of nature, and not only part of nature, but saw the gods or God in everything, or guardian spirits in everything. So an animist or pantheistic world religions or prior would have had many more intrinsic limits on what was possible, what was conceivable, because of these animistic world religions. And White is claiming that Christianity supplanted those older worldviews and replaced it with a view of God as not in the world but transcendent from the world, that humans were part of the world, we are uniquely made in God's image, and that not only that, we're meant to have dominion over it, to subdue it, we have dominion over the birds of the sky and the fish of the sea and things like that. So he says that it even says we're supposed to use nature in this way. Going on in his view then, we're really not part of nature. We're separate from it. This is what sometimes metaphysicians call dualism too, right? There were two things. There's the world, and then there's us. We're separate, two things, not part of it. And so this is the really most contentious way in which he puts it. In its Western form, that qualifier is important. He actually is more careful than it seems. He seems like he's painting with really broad brush strokes, but in the essay actually says that he's talking about a particular version of Western Christianity. He says this doesn't seem in his view to be true in the Eastern tradition. I should mention right up front, he's not a philosopher, he's not a theologian, he's a historian. He's a historian of technology in particular. So we can get into whether or not we want to buy his theology, but he claims he's not making a theological claim, he's making historical claims. Maybe we can't totally separate those two. Maybe will help us talk about that a little bit later. So he says that it's anthropocentric. So he thinks that because the origins of the ecological crisis are not just that we need to build better technology, just have better science, the problem is, as Naomi Klein was saying, is the story. The story is that nature's here and it's for us and we can do whatever we want with it. If that's our story about ourselves and our relationship to nature, we'll never solve the crisis by just doing more technology, more science. that we need to change trajectories, that it's not enough just to do more of the same. And I see the sustainability paradigm as really fundamentally as trying to maintain more of the same that is problematic. So he is, interestingly, not calling for an abandonment of religion. He's suggesting that we need to redefine it. And so he actually is suggesting that within Christianity, we have resources which would bring this about potentially. Right, that in Christianity, in particular, the minority tradition that we get in St. Francis, that if we were to rely on those resources in St. Francis, which radically sort of seems to have more like a democracy of creatures, arguably, where there doesn't seem to be as many concerns with hierarchical arrangements. But he's my point in noting these parts of his essay simply to say he's not just attacking religion. He's not even just attacking Christianity. He's saying Christianity is part of this problem, and Christianity needs to be an important part of the solution, too. By drawing on elements of its own tradition that have been marginalized for centuries. So he even recommends then that St. Francis be the patron saint of ecology at the end of his essay, which is ironic, as we'll find. So this is Ellen White's thesis, that this is the roots of the ecological crisis are to be found in a particular conception of ourselves and nature, which is ultimately located in Christianity. We can talk about this in the question and answer if you want. But just to start to avoid possible misunderstandings, he's not claiming that you need to be Christian in order to have this worldview. He's saying it started with Christianity, but he thinks most people now have this conception of themselves in the world, and now it's completely free-floating from Christianity. So it's not that he's saying this is Christians. He's saying it's a particular worldview which has its origins genealogically in a particular interpretation of Christianity. So it's a slightly more nuanced interpretation. So maybe what we should do then is not appeal to sustainability, which tries to maybe leave things in place, but maybe we should appeal to this conception of stewardship as a better framework for understanding ourselves and our relationship to nature. And that maybe this idea of being stewards of nature would address some of the concerns that I had with sustainability. And in some ways, I think that is true, that the stewardship notion is more full-bodied of a moral concept than sustainability is. We could give a version of this story for each of the mainline churches, and even within Christianity, you could give a version of this account that I'm about to. Within Islam, you could give a version of it within most world religions. You could give a story, in other words, of within the last few decades, when was the point at which important authors started to talk about ecology, the environment, and that tradition in Islam, in the Episcopal Church, you'll find versions of this. So I'm going to give the Catholic one, as I know it best, and we're in Jesuit school. But not because we couldn't give another one. We could. So that's John Paul II. In 1990, he delivered the World Peace Day speech on January 1st, 1990. And that World Peace Day speech was called The Ecological Crisis of Common Responsibility. It was remarkable in many different ways. Actually, I'm getting ahead of my own lead, though. I should mention that John Paul II made St. Francis patron saint of ecology in 1979. I'm not claiming that there's any relationship between that having happened and Lynn White's statement. I'm not at all saying it, but it is kind of cool that in some ways you could see that as the start of doing what Lynn White was saying needed to happen, was pulling on resources that hadn't necessarily been drawn on. More important and more interesting in a way in the 1990 piece is that Pope St. John Paul II at this point, although not at that point, simply stipulates that obviously we're having an ecological crisis in 1990. Obviously climate change is human-caused and is causing terrible problems in 1990, 26 years ago. States it as a matter of fact, which is remarkable, right? And in part we could suggest why that might be the case, because this is a global church and it was only in the United States that we were still debating about it. But we can get into why that's an interesting thing. Number two, he links the pursuit of peace and respect for nature as one thing, not two things. And so it links social justice and environmental justice in a way that many of the environmentalists weren't doing, right? We've got the social justice people over here and the environmentalists over here, and they're really seen as doing different things, maybe sometimes competing things. And one of the things that was distinct about the Catholic Church was saying these are one thing, that we can't protect nature without helping the poor. Didn't they start? It was heavily emphasized. This was a World Peace Day speech, after all. We can't have peace, he says, unless we also have peace in our relationship to nature, and links those two together. And then argues that the idea of an ethic of life, a consistent ethic of life, is especially focused on human life, as having a special dignity and worth, especially, but it's not exclusively. It's an especially. Right? So that a consistent ethic of life is one which says all living things matter and deserve respect. Not the same amount, but all things do deserve it. So humans especially, but not exclusively. And then finally, the theme of the piece that he hits over and over again is that the ecological crisis is not merely a technological problem, it is a moral problem. It has to do with how we see ourselves in relationship to nature, our conceptions of meaning and value, implying then that we can't address and solve the common responsibility of the ecological crisis unless we address it at its root, which is moral. That technology maybe is needed, but isn't the solution unless it's set within a more fundamental context. Fast forward 25 years. In the interim, we've got Benedict XVI, who regularly writes on the topic. He was called at the time the Green Pope. And so we can't forget him. There was no discontinuity. I don't mean to imply discontinuity. I'm just truncating for brevity's sake. Laudato Si was in the works for a long time. I kept hearing rumors that we're going to get an encyclical on the environment, and I was crossing my fingers for ages and ages, so curious about what would it be like to have that level of social teaching just primarily on the environment. And finally, this last summer, we got it with Laudato Si. On care for our common home from Pope Francis. I don't have time to go over everything that's exciting about this document. I'm going to try and list all of them, but a lot of them. And then I'm going to expand on a couple in particular tonight. So, one thing that's exciting is how he explicitly and by name rejects anthropocentrism. No equivocation, no ambiguity, uses the term, which is remarkable all by itself, and rejects anthropocentrism, which is really interesting. Also explicitly rejects dualism, that we are not separate from nature, we are a part of creation. There's only one creation. How could there be any other way, right? Obviously there's not creation and then us, there's creation, and we're part of it. Even if uniquely made in God's image, that doesn't mean that we're outside of nature, hovering on the outside. Reinterprets, and I'm going to get to some of these passages. This is one of the ones I'm going to expand on, reinterpreting what is meant by the term dominion. That is the Genesis term. We can't just pretend it's not there. The question is, though, theologically, what does it mean? What is a good interpretation of what dominion really means? This was so, I was so amazed and excited to see this line when Pope Francis uses the term intrinsic value, and then unambiguously says, all living things have intrinsic value. Humans have intrinsic value, animals have intrinsic value, and plants have intrinsic value. And uses that term, intrinsic value, is important primarily because it allows me and my work in environmental ethics to say that, because in environmental ethics, everything is written in the language of intrinsic value. That's the debate. What has intrinsic value, what doesn't? So by using the term, he allows us to make him enter into that conversation directly with no loss. There's an immediate entrance into conversation between those two ongoing discussions, which was very exciting. Not only that, but he says species have intrinsic value, and explicitly says that ecosystems have intrinsic value. Remarkable. And finally, I'm going to expand on this as well. 3 and 7, I'll expand on a little bit more. Emphasizes care in particular, which might be intentional and might be important that he emphasizes the idea of care in particular. So I'm going to look a little more at 3 and 7 now. Am I doing okay? You're with me? All right. So, some passages from Pope Francis here on in reinterpreting what we mean by dominion. What I find remarkable about this, having just looked at Lynn White, for me, and this could be just that I can't get Lynn White's thesis out of my head. I teach it every semester, and then I go on and teach Pope Francis now. So I have them constantly juxtaposed, and maybe that's why I hear Lynn White's words in my ears when I'm reading passages like this, but it's remarkable to me that Pope Francis is admitting in a way that at times the scriptures have been misinterpreted and misused. That it was bad theology. If that's what we were entailing, it was bad theology. We were doing a bad job. That admits historically sometimes we were incorrectly interpreting the scriptures. So in part, I think, admitting Lynn White's kind of thesis, that it's not that it's theologically necessary, but it was historically contingent that we interpret the scriptures this way, and that it was a bad interpretation, and that we should interpret differently. This one as well, an inadequate presentation of Christian anthropology. Anthropology here, right, meaning what it is to be human, and what it is to be human in relationship to the non-human. What are we, and what are we in relationship to the rest of creation? An inadequate conception of Christian anthropology gave us the wrong understanding of ourselves and our relationship to nature. We thought that we were completely separate from everything else, and that that's not what the scriptures entail. Instead of a good interpretation, what was handed down was this Promethean mastery over nature, which is, he's saying, bad theology. So if that was how it was interpreted, and he thinks it is sometimes, he's admitting sometimes that's how it was interpreted, that was a bad idea. That instead of dominion over the universe, we should see ourselves as having being responsible stewards of, not dominion over, responsible stewards of creation. Now, as far as this goes, I think that Pope Francis' position is really onto a really important conclusion regarding a transition away from a bad interpretation to a better interpretation of these Genesis texts. And that the stewardship interpretation really is more full-bodied than the sustainability paradigm. But there's a danger inherent in the concept of stewardship, because it's frequently underdefined. It's still vague enough to allow us to fill in a lot of different things about what we mean by what it is to be a good steward. And so I think there's a cautionary tale that we need to be careful to probe a little bit more thoroughly before we latch on to this concept of stewardship. What exactly is its concept? What does it mean to be a good steward? And so in this context, I think of the paleontologist Stephen Jay Gould, who has this interesting piece in the Journal of Natural History in 1990, the same year that John Paul II, coincidentally, wrote. And it's an interesting essay. I recommend it to you. It's called the Golden Rule, A Proper Scale for Our Ecological Crisis. It's a nice essay. You can find it in PDF online pretty easily. And he says the following: such views of stewardship, however well-intentioned, are rooted in the old sins of pride and exaggerated self-importance. We're just one among millions of species. And the whole point of the essay, the subtitle is A Proper Scale for the Ecological Crisis, and he's a geologist or a paleontologist, he's thinking in geological time. By what measure, by what argument could we, arising just a geological microsecond ago, we've been around for just a blip in the 13.5 billion year history of the universe, 4.5 billion year history of our planet, right? Our planet teeming with life for 3/4 of that immense span of time. We arrived just a geological microsecond ago, and we come on the scene and say, we're in charge of keeping track of making all this work out. We're good. We arrived. Everything's okay now. We're stewards. And he's saying, well, actually he puts it this way. Nature had no idea we were coming, doesn't know we're here, and doesn't give a damn about us. That was the way he put it out right after this quotation. Like, that's how it finishes, so rather provocatively. Right? His view is that that's hubris. And it's an interesting charge, and I'd love to debate it. It's a fun one to sort of, the passage from the Pope a minute ago was, we are responsible stewards of the universe. Right? Not even of the planet, right? We're of creation of the entire universe. Now, this is a little bit of an odd transition. By way of playing with what we mean by stewardship, just as a way of getting it not too heavy again, so So we had the Jetsons, we got Wally, and now I need my Tolkien a little bit. And this is, right, I mean, it's not Narnia, but it'll have to do. I think in the third book of the Lord of the Rings trilogy, the Return of the King, you might recall. And in the Return of the King, it's about this white kingdom of Gondor, right? And the kingdom of Gondor had always been ruled by benevolent kings, the line of Numenor, blessed with long life, who were wonderful leaders in every way. But the line had been broken because of a particular set of events. The last of the line had left, and left the kingdom to a steward. Right? The steward of Gondor. Denethor, the 26th steward of Gondor, who's there to take care of, responsible for. Now, I like to think of it in this context because it helps us to get part of what's really important about the stewardship metaphor, that stewards are stewards on behalf of another. So one of the nice things about the stewardship metaphor, as an alternative story to sustainability, is that it breaks that idea that the earth is ours, right? Denethor's responsible for keeping the kingdom working, but it's not his kingdom, they're not his people, it's not his land. It's kind of a crappy job, right? And it's like all responsibility, and none of the right? Right? Steward of Gondor, he's got, it's like the Uncle Ben Spider-Man, like great power comes great responsibility. It's like that sort of, right, Spider-Man-like logic here. That's one reason why I like this context. The second reason I like the Lord of the Rings context for stewardship is Denethor in particular might be a particularly good example of the kind of stewards. If we are stewards, I think he might be the kind of steward that we are. By which I mean, at this point in the book movie, you might recall, right, he's just gotten the Horn of Gondor, which indicates to him that his oldest son, Boromir, had died in his quest to go and get the Ring of Power and bring it back to allow them to defend their territory against the forces of Mordor, which are amassing ever more, right? And at this point, he just gets the horn and realizes his son, his beloved first son, was dead, and kind of has a mental break, right? He starts using it. We know this because he takes his second son, Faramir, and sends him off to defend Minas Tirith, an impossible thing, which makes him almost die, right? He makes it back, or Faramir barely makes it back alive, but his father has lost his grip on reality, and decides to, he's going to give him a ceremonial burial on the funeral pyre because he's dead, and it's his beloved son, but he's not dead, he's still alive, he's on the funeral pyre, right? In the movie version, Gandalf and the Peregrine Took come in and save Faramir, but he gets up on the pyre and takes the torch, lights himself on fire, and he in the movie version, rather dramatically, right, on fire, runs and leaps off of the precipice. I'll just excruciatingly let this play for a second. If we are stewards in a Denethorian way, it might be the sense in which we are lighting ourselves on fire at present, right, and running off the precipice of reality, right, that we seem to be unable to stop ourselves, right? As if we're stewards, we suck at it at present. We are Denethorian stewards, right? So you get this idea, hopefully. Stewardship implies on behalf of another. The on behalf of is usually a creator. On behalf of a creator. There are secular versions of it too. It's usually on behalf of future generations of humans. It's frequently the way that it's cashed out, but it's not quite as strong of a conception as the theologically grounded, the theocentrically grounded stewardship view that it's on behalf of the king. The king is the planet, the creation is not ours, it's the creator's. Right, so it works well for that. So on this idea, I'm trying to put a little bit of a question in your mind about is stewardship really the best term we want to use? And my answer is it depends on what we mean by the term. So, set some more context. In the Encyclical, Pope Francis uses the word care far more often than stewardship. He only uses stewardship twice in the entire 300-page document. He uses care dozens of times. And Cardinal Turkson, who probably helped write the Encyclical, when it was launched, said as much, pointed out the fact, and said that it's no accident, and that the care was chosen over stewardship because care implies a loving, intimate relationship between things rather than a sterile duty connotations, supposedly, in using care. So when you have this in your mind and you start looking for care, it really does pop out all over. It's in the subtitle of the Encyclical, On Care for Our Common Home, right, that we're trying to have a care of creation, not just stewardship of it. We're supposed to have awe and wonder and appreciation and love for creation, not just a sterile duty with regard to. Solidarity with, not just present and future humans, but with creation itself. And it's supposed to then, why I like this emphasis is that stewardship can kind of allow us to just be like, yeah, we're still in charge, right? We're still masters over nature. Now we're a good, benevolent master of nature, right? And this is saying, maybe master of nature is still not implied by what we're looking for. That we need to stop thinking in those terms. That in fact, care is, as I say, this more intimate relationship. And supposedly that's one of the reasons why he took St. Francis's name as his own because he wanted to emphasize a focus on the poor and preferential option for the poor and on our relationship to creation. Seems to be the primary driving reasons for his own selection of his paper name. So what we could do is contrast two different ways of thinking about sustainability in this context, as Dr. Calhoun mentioned, that on the shallow sustainability orientation, the Lawley-Jetson's orientation, is that ecological crisis is really a technological problem to invent our way out of, to manage the problem. And that in this deeper sustainability context, in this richer stewardship context, the idea is it's not just to engineer our way out of the problem, but to change our underlying worldview, primarily and especially how it is that we see ourselves, is the goal. Whereas shallow sustainability is trying to keep the hamster wheels of consumption going as long as possible, the orientation and the aim of the other is to change our attitudes in order to be better servants of the most vulnerable and of creation. So they're fundamentally different. They're fundamentally different, but they can masquerade as the same thing by having a shallow use of the terms or a quick use of the terms without really saying what it is that they entail. Stewardship and sustainability can be conflated as though they're the same thing, and they're probably not. To give you a specific set of passages from the Encyclical, so this machine is a good example of the shallow sustainability. I'm not against it, but it is an interesting way. The point of it is to suck CO2 pollution out of the air. If we can suck CO2 pollution out of the air and turn it into fuel, we don't have to stop our consumption. We can keep consuming as much as we ever wanted to, as long as we can get the CO2 out of the air, right? And Pope Francis says that this is not going to solve the problem because it's not addressing the problem that's at stake. That it's not enough. It's not enough in the medium term to just balance money and environmental protection and emphasis on the poor. That halfway measures, compromises aren't enough. And I love this very last bit. Part of why this encyclical is so radical is he's saying our very notion of progress is needing to be redefined. What counts as progress? The new iPhone will come out in a few months, I guess. It always does. Right? So progress, you get it right? And he's saying progress is relative to an aim. And we too often just allow the status quo to say what the aim is. Obviously, the aim is more consumption for longer. And the Pope is saying, why would that be a good aim? In fact, that if our aim is human flourishing and the flourishing of nature, then we should measure progress relative to that aim. So it's a redefinition of what even counts as progress. 5 out of 6, almost there. Sorry, I go too slow. Pick up the speed. So in the book, in the Writer's and Storm, I was at a critical moment and I was worried about the word stewardship too. I was bummed about sustainability, and then I totally bummed myself out on stewardship too. And then I was debating again, do I abandon that term too, or do I try and rehabilitate it? And what I came up with, and I'm not totally satisfied with it to be honest, but it's the best I could do in the context of that project, which I had to finish one way or the other. what I came up with was that maybe we need to be stewards. Maybe we do need to be stewards, but maybe stewardship isn't of nature, but maybe what stewardship means is being good stewards of ourselves and our impact on nature. So that it should be pointed at ourselves, not out there. This is what I mean by this weird notion of self-stewardship, which I will grant you is maybe not the best term in the world, so if you have a better one, I would gladly hear it. And it happened to come to me because of reading Thomas Berry's work on the great work. Thomas Berry's a cultural historian, a passionist priest, died maybe a decade ago after a long, long life. And he talks about the idea of the great work, and I was really taken by it. And if you read this passage in the context of Naomi Klein's video clip, when she talks about stories, right? Worldviews, narratives, the problem is that we've got a really bad story, or the old story is breaking down, which is Klein's point, but we don't yet have a good news story. And the task of this generation, and probably the next several, is to construct a better story, a story about what we are. And what it is to be related to nature, that's the great work, capital G, capital W. He thinks that each moment of time, each generation, it inherits a certain kind of work that's left to it by previous generations, and this is the great work of this generation. So that's not enough. It's not enough. It's needed. It's needed, but it's not enough to put up more solar panels. I'm not against them. I like solar panels. Do more of that. More windmills. That for sure. Better transportation. Cleaner stuff. All needs to happen. But if we don't really address the root of the problem, we're really not solving the problem at all. It will continue to fester. Or it won't fester. We'll have a perfect quality life, which will be perfectly awful. Right? It'll be a half-life that's indefinitely sustainable and not at all worth having. So a few passages from Barry, and then I'll wrap up. So he thinks that this is our task here at this moment in time, is to reinvent what it is to be human, to tell ourselves a new story about how it is that we fit into nature, to become, in Leopold's words, become part of the biotic community, as full members of it. And that this is our task, and the task of the next few generations. He thinks of it as a transition. He thinks that we're not just at the end of a short evolutionary period. He thinks that right now is the end of a geological era, the end of the Cenozoic era in the geology of the Earth. And that at this point, we have a choice whether to usher in what he calls the Technozoic era or the Ecozoic era, the technocratic, industrial, mechanistic era, which completes our utter and total domination of the planet by turning it into a large artifact where we engineer every component of it, a la this Colbert clip when we geoengineer the entire planet, which we might be able to do, but ought we ethically, or the Ecozoic era, which allows us to try to conceive a way of becoming part of nature, and that's the great work. That's the task before us, is to meaningfully join the community, or to use some of Pope Francis. One of my very favorite lines in the Encyclical is that we can't have an adequate ecology without an adequate anthropology. We can't fix our ecological crisis until we properly see what it is to be a human being in relationship to the rest of creation. Are we out of time? Because I can probably skip this entirely if we are.
Well, we're shortening our discussion time at this point.
Let's stop here, because this was just sort of a reflection on what this might mean for Gonzaga's curriculum, but this is self-contained without it, so I think we'll just stop there. Thank you.
Our approach at the Socratic is often to have a comment response, and Dr. Doug Fries from the philosophy department is going to make a few comments, and then we'll have some questions and discussion.
Okay, thank you for turning the lights up too. So I'm decidedly low tech compared to Brian, so I'll just read some things. As Brian indicated, I am very interested in the pedigree of ideas. And so my first remark is simply a comment on the Lynn White thesis, which claims that Christianity is responsible for an anthropocentric worldview that pervades the West and has led to humanity's abuse of nature. The roots of this worldview are to be found in Genesis 1:28, fill the earth and subdue it. Dr. Calhoun read the entire passage for us earlier. Well, to move along rather quickly, it seems to me that the trouble with White's thesis is that there's just no real evidence that anyone, either Jewish or Christian, understood the Genesis text in the way White says that they did. It seems to me that the work of the Jewish medievalist Jeremy Cohen pretty much disproves White's thesis. There just isn't any empirical evidence, historical evidence, supporting White's view prior to modern times. It sounds great speculatively, but where's the empirical evidence? It's just not there. And in any case, White has also an historically inaccurate picture of Francis of Assisi as well. For Francis certainly understood himself as thinking and acting in accord with the Bible. But I won't get into commenting on Francis just now. I would simply say, though, that in any case, the Bible isn't anthropocentric, it's theocentric. Human beings are not the highest things in the Bible, any more than they are in Aristotle, for example. So, to me, I don't find Lynn White's thesis at all compelling. Well, so what? The inaccuracy of White's thesis, in my view at least, leads to a misunderstanding about the origin and nature of this anthropocentric, abusive attitude towards nature that Professor Henning is against. In the event, I think it can be pretty easily established that early modern political philosophies break with the pre-modern is the origin of the problematic worldview that Dr. Henning criticizes. The texts, in my view, are in Machiavelli, Bacon, and Descartes for starters. So I guess I agreed with the position of Naomi Klein, that she, the movie clip that Dr. Henning showed in the beginning. To paint with broad strokes, pre-modern political philosophy argued that the first two virtues necessary for proper human moral development were courage and moderation. Courage consists of a proper stance with respect to the problem of death, or to state it positively, with respect to the deep-seated human desire for immortality. Moderation consists of a proper stance with respect to the problem of pleasure, and particularly with the pleasures of food, sex, and drink. In the pre-modern view, it is necessary to use either the shame provided by religion or the force of the laws to curb these two primordial desires. And then, for those who are too erotic to be tamed by shame or law, there is always philosophy, which turns one's longings towards a good that can be shared because it is immaterial and infinite. Then that's pure Plato there. In modern Enlightenment political philosophy, virtue may be dispensed with because of the technological innovations of contemporary natural science that conquers nature for the purpose of, in Bacon's words, quote, the relief of man's estate, close quote. Instead of courage in the face of a longing for immortality, modern medicine will make us live a long time in this world, maybe even forever, as both Descartes and Bacon suggest. And instead of moderation, chemicals can be developed that will make it possible to indulge the sexual passions without giving rise to the problem of excessive procreation. Human existence won't just be fun and long-lasting, though. It will also be comfortable. Consider all the various innovations and gadgets that Descartes promises the new science will yield. In short, in the modern view, one does not need to go to the trouble of changing one's soul and making it virtuous. Okay, then my third point. The historical inaccuracy of White's thesis might not seem like any big deal. But if the origin of the problem is misdiagnosed, the prognosis can also be misunderstood. So the question is, do we need to change our souls, perhaps by reading old books, as the ancients thought, or merely redouble our efforts to use technology to better use nature for our purposes, as the modern view would seem to suggest? One way to understand Pope Francis in Laudato Si is simply that he is arguing for the old virtue of moderation, sophrosune, as the best way to solve the current concern over climate change. One wonders, though, if he shouldn't be more moderate in claiming the advantages of moderation. After all, almost all of the most pressing environmental problems of the past, say, 50 years have been solved not through reforming our souls, but through technological innovations. Yet Francis thinks that the current concern over global warming cannot be solved in such a manner. It is impossible, it seems to me, to know ahead of time whether it can or cannot, but I've got a hunch that better, improved technology, fueled by advances in natural science, could do the trick. And if so, we won't have to go to the trouble of improving our souls after all. Unless, of course, we think having a good soul is a worthy thing, whether or not we are forced into it by environmental concerns. To use Professor Henning's language, shallow sustainability might turn out to be all we need to get along. We will still need therapy for our souls, of course, but we have always needed that, and presumably always will. Now, time permitting, I'd like to pursue the question of whether the biocentrism that Dr. Henning advocates is really substantially different from the great chain of being of the medievals, or the scala natura of the ancients, or, stated differently, whether there is anything novel about the notion of intrinsic value of all living things. These are concepts he discusses in his article in the book that didn't get discussed in the talk. So I say time permitting, I'd like to get into that, but time isn't permitting. So I'll just conclude with a final comment on Laudato Si. The Pope says that he is for curbing climate change and that he is for the poor as well. He doesn't seem to recognize clearly that there may be real tensions between these two goals. Those human beings who are seriously impoverished in our world, in order to get out of their present predicament, at present at least, need to be able to labor more efficiently, which means that they need to have access to machines and the hydrocarbons that run them. Sure, if some of us were more moderate in our use of fossil fuels, perhaps others could gain access to them, although at present fossil fuels are quite cheap anyway. But if the poor use them in order to escape poverty, well, the effect on the environment will be about the same as if we use them. The problem seems more fundamental then. Without using nature against nature, nature, as it were, won't be cajoled into meeting human needs. The natural condition of human beings, in other words, seems to be poverty. If asked to trade between poverty and climate change, it isn't obvious to me what should be chosen. But if faced with a choice between improving their souls and seeking to save themselves through technology, I'm pretty sure that modern human beings will try the latter option first.
Brian, you want to make a brief comment? Or should we just go to questions?
20 minutes?
Yeah.
I'm worried because I'll just probably try to cover all of them and then there won't be any time for discussion. So I'm going to resist my debater's instincts, which is, and just let Doug's really good, very clear comments as part of our conversation, and hoping that maybe the rest of the audience wants to jump in.
Okay, shoot, questions, comments?
Yes, sir.
Can I do a world White's thesis? Is there any? It seems like it's sort of an unverifiable claim because I would argue that one of the primary differences between treatment in the environment today and treatment in the environment in the pre-modern era is the technology to be able to do so. And so you could argue that medieval people would have subdued the earth the way that we're subduing it today, but they couldn't have. So, I mean, in the academic debates over that,
White's thesis in the full version is primarily that, because he's a historian of technology in particular. So he argues that technology developed in the West and not as much elsewhere, and this is where he might not be on very good historical ground, so we'd have to debate the history of it too. But he says there's a reason why the particularly powerful or aggressive forms of technology were developed in the West, and he thinks it was not that Christianity required it, but that Christianity made it possible when other worldviews made it less possible. So for example, he would say, if you thought that in that stand of trees was where the guardian spirits were, or in that stream, you wouldn't clear cut the forest or dam the stream because that's where the guardian spirits were. So that it was, his claim is that it changed the worldview, and the worldview is what gives you your set of things that are possible. So it's not that it necessitated it, it all of a sudden made things a live possibility that were not a live possibility before. I don't go home and debate about whether to eat my dog, because in my worldview it's not really a live option for me. I could, and some people in other cultures debate about it, but in my worldview it's not even it doesn't come up as a consideration. So that's what White's claiming, and it's primarily about technology. So he thinks medieval technology formed, and that modernity came about in the West because of a particular interpretation of Western Christianity, and didn't come about in the Eastern Orthodox Church, for example, which he says has a very different view about the environment and about its relationship to nature. So it is a slippery thing, and Doug's claims are right. I've tried to look too, and I don't think Doug is wrong that, or Dr. Chris is wrong. I think he's right that I think you'd be hard pressed to find documentary evidence, and so the kind of evidence he seems to be pointing to is well, either made up or is a slippery sort. Because Pope Francis seems to be pointing to the same thing. There's been a kind of misinterpretation over time, but it's not as though you're going to find a church father saying, do this. Now, where did it come from then?
bacon.
You know, I think that, let me put a finer point so we get other voices in here. I'd be okay if at the end I said all of this would still work if it was Bacon and Descartes and Hobbes' fault. I'd be okay with that. I would be okay with that. I'd say there's plenty of blame to go around right there, and I'd be okay with starting there and moving forward.
For the record, I wasn't saying it was Bacon as opposed to White's more ancient thesis, but he does in Northern Down, he repeats over and over. He says subdue so many times. He says dominion so many times.
But most of those early moderns were theists. Most of those early moderns were Christian theists who were also making claims about their particular interpretation of Christianity.
I think no more Morgan was looking at the records, so.
Could I just make a quick point on this? What Jeremy Cohen has done is look, for example, at the Hebrew word behind the word that's translated as subdue in Genesis. And the Midrashim just don't include an interpretation of subdue that makes it possible to treat nature according to the whim of human beings, or the Hebrew word behind dominion. And secondly, the point is well taken that the medievals didn't have the technology to do these things to nature if they had wanted to. But why did technology develop? Okay, it didn't just happen one day.
Yeah.
Okay, people consciously intended. If you read Bacon, if you read Descartes, let's subdue nature.
Yeah.
Let's do it. Okay, why? And they had definite reason. It was planned. It was intended. Machiavelli's image, let's put nature on the rack and force her to yield her secrets. Okay? That this is not, he doesn't appeal to Genesis or anything. They have something definite in mind.
I mean, this has old historical ties to Epicureanism and Stoicism's view of the way they relate to nature and science. So, the idea of natura, all through it, there is the image of making nature lay herself bare, expose her so that we aren't afraid of her anymore. And so, one of the things I want to say is that it is a both and, right? So, what's amplified in the modern period is a tendency to view nature this way, and so that I think it's a mistake to say it only occurred in this modern period, that there's a tendency in certain types of ideologies and worldviews that become amplified in the modern period and gain more traction in the modern period, that are there in their kernels and their seeds in the classical world, in antiquity, but aren't having their cultural heyday just yet.
Yeah, I'm very sympathetic with that because it doesn't hang it all on a particular time and point in which these set of texts were interpreted, but it was a common, I think, to a number of different traditions, probably in a couple of places on the planet, but it doesn't disturb the overall thesis, right? Which is that that's probably what needs to change is that underlying assumption, which is common to a lot of different views. One of Thomas Berry's nice lines is that we need to start seeing reality as a communion of subjects, not as a collection of objects, right? So there's this objectifying, distancing sort of that needs to be undone without it flattening as an ontological egalitarianism. It's more of a joining the biotic community, but not making everybody equal citizen as Leopold would have it necessarily. So you can keep the natura. I do in my work a version of a hierarchy, but you could still have a continuum, which it doesn't have a break, a dualism, bifurcation. That's what I'm against. Is the bifurcation is the root of the problem, which comes up in a lot of different traditions. Is the bifurcation of us from nature.
But, well, so we're debating a historical point, and maybe we should go on, but ancient notions of nature included human beings. Human beings belong to nature. Yeah, and these modern notions, nature is what's left over if you take human beings.
But, well, okay, we are getting into the weeds, but I'm happy to go there. Sir.
Go, Brian.
I would like your response to the hypothesis that stewardship drives technology. And as an instance of this, 90% of the power generation, I don't know where I got this statistic, 90% of the new power generation is green.
So last year, yeah, in terms of percentage of new coming online, that's right. But you linked it to stewardship in what you have in mind, just so I make sure I answer the question you're asking. Do you see that as an example of the stewardship paradigm or the sustainability paradigm, or?
Stewardship drives technology. That's my.
I guess what I would like to say personally is we need to know what we mean by the term in order to decide whether or not, in fact, that's an expression of stewardship or not. Some people would say cutting down forest is being a good steward of the forest. I'm being a good steward of our wood resources, right? They'll use the language in a really euphemistic sort of way, and so then I get nervous. Then we look, pretty Denethorian in our stewardship pretty quickly. Is that what you? But I feel like I'm missing the thrust of your question.
An example would be the one that in the film clip, the filmmaker was permitted this comedian to make fun of the idea of trying to develop a kind of technology that would put particles into space that would deflect. Now, I have no idea whether this would work or not, but obviously these people are trying to develop a kind of technology.
I think you can go the other way and say technology drives stewardship. Either way, I think that without technological change, you're not going to have improvement.
Yeah, I guess I'd put it this way: the technology should be in service of a good, and that your conception of the good needs to be, in fact, good. And what we instead do frequently is not think about what we mean by a good life, we're silent about that, allowing the status quo notion to sort of fill in that void. And then we say, let's do new technology. But I say, well, I want to do new technology too, but what's it in service of? It's a means, not an end to itself. Like technology is a means to, and then what? What are those unstated ends? I want to get them up. That's what I see the job of the philosopher, is to try and get that stuff that's sort of underneath and sort of bring it up to the surface and say, do we really, what is a good life? Is it late stage consumer society? Klein's movie, by the way, and I hope you all come. I wrote it down. It's on the 7th, April 7th, from 7 to 8:30. The rest of the movie. Her view is that it's capitalism. The subtitle of the book is Capitalism versus the Climate. And the poverty question is an interesting one in that sort of context. We get another sort of attempt to solve the problem by looking at its roots. So we all are kind of agreeing that the story is the problem, but then we get slightly different diagnoses and slightly different solutions because of that. Is that fair?
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah, two things that I could. I'm not a philosopher at all, but one of the things that you both seem to, the comments have seemed to imply, maybe I misinterpreted, that you know, Machiavelli and Bacon and some folks like that kind of paved the way for this subjugation of nature. And I wonder if somebody do, I don't know if philosophers do empirical research, but that sounds like an empirical question to me. And it seems to me that my guess is, by nature, you know, my gut is that if Bacon had never existed and if Machiavelli had never existed, then we would still have coal-fired power plants right now.
There's a question about technological determinism is a live one, and it's a complicated discussion, but I would be of the view that, and this is just philosophy, right? We're committed to the idea that a genealogy of ideas, we only select among possibilities that seem to be possibilities. And so certain ideas come up, they get a grip of people, and then they create a new set of things to be possible that didn't even ever come about before. And we have a linear idea of a continuing progression, of technological progression, and I'm saying that we keep progressing technologically, but it actually, depending on what counts as progress, we're regressing. We're not achieving, keeping flourishing at all, right? So technological determinism, I'd say no, absolutely not. I don't think it's necessary. If we had a different conception of what's good, we would have developed different technologies that would have achieved, well, at least would have tried to pursue those different conceptions of what's good.
Let me make a comment, just because I guess from the business school, I hear capitalism, and one of the things that kind of, when you talk about a new story, you're really talking about preferences. And that to me is kind of where the Encyclical and all this kind of melds with the marketplace, is that, you know, until, you know, it's pretty hard to derail, you know, I guess you call it modernism or capitalism or whatever it is, without, you know, without new preferences. And, you know, certainly stewardship and solar panels have to do with preferences, and the poor have to do with preferences. And until people, you know, that becomes part of their attention system.
One of the things that makes it sometimes difficult for philosophers and economists to have a common enough vocabulary to talk is preferences, and I'd want to transition to values, and then I'd have a pretty maybe different conception of what we mean by those terms. But if we could pump up preferences to a full-bodied notion of intrinsic value, then we'd be on closer terms. But not adequate response. Dale Jameson, a philosopher, puts it this way. Economics can tell us how to achieve our ends efficiently, but it can't tell us what our ends are or whether we should be concerned to achieve them efficiently. Right. So the job of the philosopher is to say, well, what are our ends and our aims? And then say, okay, economists and technologists and engineers design societies and communities and economies to achieve what is good. And so I just want to I don't want to get rid of economics. I'm not trying to nudge you off your chair off onto the floor, but more like, can I have a seat at the table and let's talk about real ends, not just preferences, but preferences for what ends.
And I would suggest that it wouldn't be a bad idea for some philosophers to get together with some marketing people, because right now I think the marketing people are winning. You know what I mean?
Yeah, at the climate negotiations, philosophers aren't invited. I mean, economists are invited, and political. It sounds silly, but I'm deadly serious, and I'm very annoyed. It's sort of right? I mean, and nothing's achieved either way, so we might as well be there because nothing's achieved anyway. So you could blame it on us for nothing being achieved. Yes, sir. By the window. We have maybe one more.
So I think you said that Pope Francis calls for the flourishing of both the impoverished, the poor, vulnerable, and the environment. And you said, not sure if the flourishing of the poor and the environment aren't mutually exclusive.
At least in some cases, or at least in 10.
So my question really is the values. What is flourishing? What should it be? What is flourishing of the poor? Is it an economic flourishing or is it something else? And what is flourishing of the environment? Are these definitional issues?
Partly. Doug and I would agree. I liked your comments about the soul and improvement of the soul. I mean, that's kind of where I ended up in the book project, was thinking that climate change brought about completely new ethical issues. And the more I looked at it, of course, I realized they're exactly the same issues that have always been there. We're mortal, we're going to die, what should we do with the time we have? Now it's species writ large, but it's still the same problem we've always confronted, which is human flourishing. How do we conceive of, define that? Philosophers, that's what one of our minor roles is supposed to try to be, to contribute to that conversation. And then one of the things that environmental ethics adds is a conversation about how that fits itself within also the flourishing of the larger world of which we're a part. And so that's what I spend, that's what environmental ethicists spend most of their time trying to think through and define.
Have you come up with any?
Yeah, got the answers.
When I was talking about poverty, I meant something very basic: enough food to eat, water to drink, things like that. Okay, so I wasn't talking about anything more than that. In order to meet human needs, just to stay.
So you're talking about economic flourishing.
I'm talking about enough to eat. These people need to be able to participate in an economy, okay, in a way that they're presently not able to do so. Okay. And I can at least think of situations in which it's not possible for them to do that if they don't have access to funds.
The empirical research, to go back to the question that Dr. Hickman was bringing up on the question of human flourishing, is interesting. Some of the positive psychology research finds that people's self-reporting on their own happiness goes up with each additional increment of wealth to a certain interesting, relatively low level, around the first $10,000 or $20,000. And then each additional increment of wealth, they report they're less happy each additional increment. And so, yet our notions of measuring human flourishing are usually, purchasing power, economic wealth, And so, we probably just need to redefine those measures, and economics would probably do that. And there are some interesting models that Dr. Hickman knows more about than I do that try and, gross happiness product and all these sort of other measures that I think you even teach about, right, in some of your classes. So he could give us a very nice, and he should be invited back to give a nice lecture on those. So there are ways of
happiness.
Well, it's where philosophy and economics are kind of talking about the same thing, but kind of not. And where are we equivocating and where are we not is an interesting question. What I worry is, though, when we look at the poor, we say we need to make them have our standard of living. And I think that's completely the wrong point, is that we're not particularly happy, even though we have lots of wealth. That shouldn't be possible. Krista, I think that's your last point, and then I think we're done.
I just wanted to return us to that conversation about Bacon and Machiavelli and Lucretius, because those images are very, very violent descriptions of nature, right? So we're talking about subjugating, making her reveal
torture,
secrets, right?
Yeah.
So setting aside the whole gender issue, and we're talking here about a woman being subjugated. What we didn't mention is that this is just wrong, and the moral instinct behind that is what should be explicated here, right? So, and what's the core of that issue? Why is that wrong? Is because when we have a relationship between somebody who's vulnerable and we could take advantage of her or it, our moral obligation is to say, well, I don't need to do that, right? That's why I don't eat my cat who lives with me. I could throw her off of the balcony, I could break her neck, but the whole relationship, I care for that cat. What that means is
is that I protect her from all of that, and most importantly, I protect her from my own power over her, right?
Yeah.
So that's, I think, what is not captured by the notion of stewardship, and I think that that's the moral instinct there that somehow needs to be captured.
Well said, yeah, thank you for that. The stuff on feminist ethics and care would be really interesting to explore after the Encyclical. I don't know the literature well enough, but if somebody does, it would be a really cool comparison to say to what degree are they using the terms in similar ways. And ecofeminism is also similarly logical domination would be another mostly sympathetic sort of addition to this discussion as well. But you put it much better than I did, so that is a really good point. Thank you all.
Thank you.